Alrighty, y'all. It has been a brain exploding, punching the air, staring blankly into the ether kind of a month. And there is simply too much that I would like to fix my mouth to say, and most of it will get me banned on most platforms. So, for that reason, I decided that it was about time that I hop on the podcast bandwagon and run my mouth. That's what I'm good at. So, let's get into it. My name is Noelle, and this is Just Say No. Alright, so you may or may not have heard, on Monday, November 6th, 69-year-old Paul Kessler was murdered by a pro-Palestinian protester in LA when the protester bashed Kessler over the head with a megaphone, ultimately resulting in his death. Now, this was just one of many violent anti-Semitic hate crimes that we have seen not only in America but across the world over the last few weeks. Although, don't ask Karine Jean-Pierre about them because she will either deny them or claim that it's Islamophobic to even ask about anti-Semitism. But I digress. So I would like to focus on this case in particular for a moment, and specifically I want to talk about the media's portrayal of it. It's not new news that the media portrays things in whatever way best suits their narrative. We saw this with the leak of the Nashville Manifesto last week, which we'll get into on here in a bit. But first, I would like to go through some media headlines about this murder in comparison with a different hate crime that happened earlier this month in Chicago. On October 16th, a 6-year-old Muslim boy and his mother were attacked by their landlord, seemingly because they were Palestinian. The boy, stabbed 26 times, died from his injuries, and the mother is currently in the hospital at the time of filming this. Now, it goes without saying that this is an egregious act of hate, of vitriol, somebody who is absolutely out of their mind. And if this man is guilty, found guilty in court, I hope that he never sees the light of day again. The point of this segment is to compare the way 4 mainstream media outlets portray these two stories. Let's start with NPR. NPR's headline for Paul Kessler reads, "An elderly Jewish man dies after an altercation with pro-Palestinian protesters." They're reporting for the Muslim boy, quote, "Funeral goers mourn the death of 6-year-old boy killed in anti-Muslim stabbing." From The Guardian, quote, "Jewish man dies after altercation at California Israel-Palestine protests." Subtitle reads, "Police say Paul Kessler fell backwards and hit his head on the ground, and death is being treated as a homicide." The Guardian on the Muslim boy. Landlord accused of killing 6-year-old Muslim boy and stabbing mother. Time magazine, quote, "Jewish man in California dies after confrontation during Israel-Hamas war protests." Time magazine on the Muslim boy. Police say Israel-Hamas war motivated Islamophobic hate crime in Illinois. Reuters. California Jewish man dies after altercation at Israel-Palestinian protests. Reuters. Illinois man charged with hate crime and fatal stabbing of Muslim boy. The main and biggest difference is the attention to detail. Where one headline says, "Jewish man dies after altercation," the other says, "hate crime and fatal stabbing." If the shoe were on the other foot, one could hypothetically say, "Elderly man bludgeoned to death in anti-Semitic hate crime," and likewise, "Woman and child found dead after visit from landlord." You see how the way these headlines are framed shape the way you perceive each story? To either heighten or lessen an emotional response, some might call it manipulation. It's frustrating, and this isn't a single example. Every time the race or religion of the perpetrator or victim doesn't fit the exact media narrative, there always seems to be some sort of sleight of hand. Alright, y'all, so I need to give you a fair warning. There's about to be a sharp decrease in audio quality on this next segment because I recorded it at a later date because I felt like this episode wasn't long enough. And I forgot to turn my microphone on. So I apologize, and we are just going to file it under You Live and You Learn. All right, enjoy. Another recent story that is almost more disturbing somehow is that of a story of Jonathan Lewis, a 17-year-old high school student who was beaten to death outside of his high school by 15 other students. Now, this all happened after he tried to stop those same 15 kids from beating on another kid who is reportedly Jonathan's friend. This all happened on November 1st, and after fighting for his life for the last 2 weeks, Lewis died on November 13th of this year, 2023. Now, this has gotten close to no national attention other than a few kind of obscure news websites are reporting on this. I think it's kind of gaining traction as of today, the 14th. So from yesterday to today, it's gained a little bit more traction, and I kind of feel like it makes sense. Like, this doesn't seem to me like a national story. It's absolutely horrible and sad, but it isn't necessarily national breaking news. Why? Because this isn't a common occurrence. Kids don't tend to beat up and murder their schoolmates, which on the other hand will make the case more interesting, but it isn't anything to necessarily protest in the name of, if you will. If you recall such a case as George Floyd, which not only became a national story, but he became a martyr. For what? As much as the Lewis case is pretty much an anomaly, dying at the hands of a police officer is also an anomaly. A black man in America has less than a 0.0018% chance of dying at the hands of an officer. Statistically, a black man is more likely to get shot by another black man on the streets of Chicago than they are to be shot by an officer. But nobody is marching to end gang violence because there generally isn't a big, power-hungry white man to villainize in those stories. And I know what you must be thinking, but Noelle, I hear about these stories of all the racist police officer and everyone talks about them. How can you say this isn't happening? Well, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. What I am saying is that when it does happen, the media takes those stories, the Floyds, the Browns, they make them media stars. They blow these unbelievably uncommon stories so far out of the water and talk about them so extensively that we, the people, now believe that they are a common thing that happens all of the time, when in reality it is just a few rare instances that they talk about so much that we think it happens all of the time. Now, of course, not every instance of police brutality becomes a national story, but they sure do try, don't they? But the fact of the matter is that the supply simply does not meet the demand in terms of racist police officers or racism in general, which is why you see so many hoax stories happening. I think of Bubba Wallace with his noose hanging in his trailer that actually ended up just being the rope that is used to close the trailer, or Jussie Smollett. All of these stories where people are claiming to have these crazy racist encounters, 9 times out of 10 turn out to be fake, which is kind of sad if you think about it, because it's like the guy who cried wolf. People are crying racism for someone looking at them sideways. If there is an actual incidence of racism, nobody's going to believe you because you've been sitting here crying racism over the tiniest thing. I think about this case study that was done where there was a group of people, and I think it's called the SCAR test or something like that. They put like a prosthetic scar on their face and sent them into a job interview to see if they were treated any differently for having a scar on their face. And right before they went in for the interview, they stopped them to do touch-ups on the scar, when in reality they actually removed the prosthetic scar off of their face, unbeknownst to them. So when they went into this interview, they were seeing discrimination where it wasn't, because the person conducting the interview obviously isn't seeing a scar because they removed it, but the person thinks that they have a scar. So when they left the interview, they were like, yes, I definitely experienced discrimination based on my disfigurement and what have you, when there was no disfigurement. And it's very similar to people who cry racism these days. But anyways, to get us back on topic, you have to wonder if this Lewis story would be more popular in the news if it had been a black kid killed by 15 white kids. Would that have changed the level of interest in the media? We'll never know. Oh, I mean, unless we will. If we look at another recent story that happened earlier this year, Ralph Yarl was shot by Andrew Lester when he knocked on his door thinking that it was the house that his twin brothers were at and he was supposed to go pick them up. And it ended up being the wrong house, and Andrew Lester shot this teenager. I can't recall if he shot him through the door or if he opened the door and shot him. I don't remember. Either way, horrible crime. Absolutely horrifying, terrifying, incredibly sad. But the one thing that I do want to point out, much like what we were talking about earlier with the difference in media coverages, is the difference in media coverages of these two cases. NBC News headline for Yarl says, "White man shot black teenager when he knocked on the wrong door, will stand trial." Versus NBC News on the Lewis case says, "Las Vegas teen dies after being attacked by 15 people while defending friends." The times and stories in which they use race and in which they choose to amplify a story is solely to create a narrative that we live in a racist country. And if you have a story that contradicts that narrative, such as black on black crime in the case of gangs or black on white crime, race is either not mentioned in the report or the story is just not reported. And this happens all of the time. These are just a couple of examples, but I suggest dialing your mind in to start noticing this, because once you start noticing this, it becomes incredibly obvious. The media is a master manipulator, but thankfully, many are waking up to this. Which is a great segue into the Nashville Manifesto. So this was huge news last week. Everybody was upside down, couldn't figure out heads or tails. Is it real? Is it not real? Well, as of filming this, we have confirmation that it is real. I had posted a video about this on my TikTok, and it got deleted nearly immediately. I believe it was only up for about 20 minutes for hateful behavior. The story was broke by Steven Crowder and his team over at Louder with Crowder, and his video got removed from YouTube for their violent criminal organizations policy. Now, neither of these reasons make much sense. The point I made in a secondary video on my TikTok in response to my original video getting deleted was that there is nothing hateful about speaking out on the topic of a person shooting 6 people in cold blood. What's hateful is shooting 6 people in cold blood. Are you joking? And the same logic extends to Crowder's violation for violent criminal organizations. Nobody even knows what that means. I don't even think YouTube knows what that means, but I digress. At the time my video had been posted, these pages hadn't been confirmed yet, and I had disclaimed that. However, the Metro Police released a statement on Twitter confirming these pages are in fact authentic, and the videos are still being censored on every platform except for the only one that values free speech, which is of course Twitter, or X, I guess now. So in a statement from Metro Police, it reads from Chief John Drake, "I am greatly disturbed by today's unauthorized release of 3 pages of writing from the Covenant shooter. This police department is extremely serious about the investigation to identify the person responsible. This action showed a total disregard for Covenant families as well as the court system, which has control of the shooter's journals at this present time due to litigations filed earlier this year. We are not at liberty to release the journals until the court rules." So first of all, I would just like to question, in there it says they're extremely serious about the investigation to identify the person responsible. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the person responsible identified when the police shot them while they were being responsible for their crimes? But, let's not think too much into that, I guess. So it's also come out that Metro Police have placed 7 officers on administrative leaves, which definitely strikes me as odd, and many others. Before they were placed on leave, while the pages were still being verified, many people were calling this a selective leak, meaning the shooter hated everyone, and the pages that were leaked were only leaked to paint a specific picture, because the pages that were leaked certainly have an anti-white slant to them. I'm not going to read them. You can find them on Steven Crowder's Twitter page for yourself. But there are several points in which the shooter refers to her victims as rich little crackers, uses gay slurs. It's not very pretty, but regardless, people were saying that this was a selective leak. A simple solution, if this were to be a selective leak, would be to release the rest of the journals. This would provide the evidence that this is selective and give a fair picture to the mindset of this shooter, but instead they placed 7 officers on leave. Now, this portrayal of someone who killed people for being white is highly inconvenient to those in the media that enjoy a nice white-on-black crime to spread and talk about for months on end. But this, a white trans-identifying woman who killed 3 white Christian children for the specific reason of them being white, well, that just won't do. And it also sparks need for a larger conversation in our society that they don't want to have. Maybe the things being taught in schools are not helpful. Perhaps things such as CRT that teaches children that they are guilty from birth for being white or a victim from birth for being black is not the kind of messaging we need to be instilling in our children. Either way, we are still waiting to see if they release more. I highly doubt it, because I just don't personally have too much faith in the media's honesty. So take it or leave it. But anyways, on a lighter note, I guess, J.K. Rowling is canceled once again for sticking up for women's rights once again, and the people canceling are feminists. So, in the original tweet that she sent out, she was commenting on a court ruling in South Australia, and she said, asking women to refer to her male rapist or violent assaulter as she in court is a form of state-sanctioned abuse. Female victims of male violence are further traumatized by being forced to speak a lie. Now, this is in response to a practice note that came out in South Australia that essentially says the court seeks to facilitate a simple process by which legal practitioners can provide, and the court can seek guidance and clarification on the pronunciation of names and preferred gender pronouns. And it's about a page and a half. I'll link it in the show notes, but it talks about how legal representation can choose to use the person whom they're representing, their pronouns, or however you pronounce their name. And Rowling makes a really fair point. She's essentially saying that in today's society, there isn't really such thing as a please do this. This is the kind thing to do. It's definitely carries more of a do it or else. The Australian court, this story is actually kind of insane. The Australian court actually released a statement in response to J.K. Rowling, which states, unfortunately, Miss Rowling has misunderstood the protocol. It does no more than allow lawyers and others to inform the court of the correct pronunciation of their name and their preferred gender pronouns so that proceedings are conducted respectfully. However, the presiding judicial officer retains control over all forms of address used in court. For many decades, the courts of this state have taken every care to protect victims of crime and other vulnerable witnesses from the distress and trauma which might arise from their participation in a hearing. A victim of a crime would never be asked to address an accused person in a way that would cause the victim distress. I would prefer that social media commentators took the time to properly inform themselves before pressing the send button, but my only concern is to assure South Australian public that Miss Rowling's anxiety is completely unfounded. And if we know anything about Miss Rowling, she's not one to back down from a fight, ladies. So she, this is just insane. This is kind of a crazy story. She's literally going back and forth with the court of South Australia. But she says that assurance is welcome, although I note that he's addressed the matter only after it was raised publicly. No such exemption is mentioned in the practice note, which takes the ideological position that the use of preferred gender pronouns is a matter of respect. The natural inference is that a woman would be considered guilty of disrespect if she, alone in the courtroom, described her male attacker as a man, while all other court officials were addressing and describing him as a woman. And she goes on for a while. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Again, that's something you can find for yourself on her Twitter page. I can also link it in the show notes. Looking at this story, it's clear what Rowling is getting at. That women who are in court against a rapist or an assailant could be put in a position to feel pressured to refer to that man as a woman. Let's be real. Not everyone is going to have the courage to take an assailant to court. That's difficult in and of itself. However, now you're adding the additional stressor of looking like a transphobe if you don't call the man who just raped you by she, her pronouns. While the court statement says that you aren't forced to do anything, we have seen this play out in real life time and time again. In America, we aren't forced to abide by pronouns of choice, but if I were to dare to acknowledge that Dylan Mulvaney is a male, I am a bigoted transphobe. Intent doesn't always translate to real life, and I have doubts about this ruling. This story was brought to us by Dave Rubin at the Rubin Report. It says, first grade teacher skips math lessons to teach about Palestine. So in his tweet, he says, a fan in LA just sent me this. His child goes to a public school in LA where a trans teacher has been teaching first grade kids about genocide in Palestine instead of math. So Ruben had posted some screenshots that were sent to him off of this teacher's Instagram page. She says, hey, I'm not an Instagram teacher at all, LOL, but I did a lesson on the genocide in Palestine today with my first graders. I started by telling them that we weren't going to do math at the usual time because sometimes there are bigger things in the world that need our attention and we need to interrupt our usual routines to make space to learn and talk about what's happening. She then continues on in another post. Then I asked them what they already knew about what's happening. They knew a lot and had questions. And I drew a little map of the occupied territories of Palestine. Then they organically started coming up with ideas about what could happen. My fave was a kid who was like, what if they just give the land back to Palestine and find somewhere else to live? So, y'all, this story had me feeling all kinds of ways. American children are already increasingly dumber every time we blink. And this woman, whose parents have trusted their 6-year-old children to, decided, you know what? 2 plus 2 isn't that important. You know what's important is that I indoctrinate you young kids into my belief system for which I have utterly no supporting evidence or data other than 2 to 3 buzzwords I saw on Twitter. I am so sickened by all of the blatant lies that I have seen in the last month regarding Israel and Palestine. And for this woman to think that it is her responsibility to push a one-sided and false narrative about an important topic to children who are not hers is peak. I need her to resign because I am sick. I am sick. And on that note, that is going to be it for the first episode of Just Say No. Thank you guys so much for hanging in there with me through the technical difficulties. I always say I have the technological intelligence of a 3-year-old, and figuring out podcasting has definitely been a true test of my capabilities. So I appreciate you guys being patient with me and while I figure all of this out. I plan on uploading episodes on Mondays, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. As far as I'm able to tell, this should be on all of the major podcasting services, so that's Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, anything of that nature. You should be able to find this show on. And if you guys are interested, I do have a GoFundMe linked in the description below. That is just to help support the show for equipment, things of that nature. Absolutely no pressure, but for anyone who's interested, that will be in the description. And other social media information will also be in the description down below. You can find me on most things at Noelle Poulin. If it's different, again, it will be in the description down below. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next week.